I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Behind the Myth of Billions in Arms Flowing into Ukraine. And this is in response to the deluge of headlines across the Western media claiming that now that American weaponry is back on track, flowing into Ukraine, this is going to help Ukraine turn the tide of the fighting. And in a recent update on the conflict in Ukraine, I went over the most recent Pentagon assistance package for Ukraine. And I mentioned how, despite the fact there are many things listed in the package, there are no quantities. And there are no quantities because the US is running short on all of these systems. The quantities of these billions and billions of dollars of weapons, equipment, and ammunition flowing into Ukraine are too small to actually achieve the results these Western media headlines claim can be achieved. And so I'm going to read over this article for those who don't feel like reading it. The link to the article will be in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. I'm also going to go more in depth into some of the areas that I explored in the article, because there's only so much you can put in an article. And what I want to do, and at the risk of becoming tedious, I want to go over the numbers of some of the items listed in that most recent Pentagon assistance package. Things like the Javelin, which are listed there, but no quantities given. And it actually, honestly, has been a long time since I looked into the quantities of Javelins being produced, the quantities of Javelins that could possibly be available for Ukraine at this point. So I looked up all of these things. I got the numbers directly from Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of the system. I also looked into adjacent systems like the Swedish-made NLAW. We've heard stories about that. I've done research into that. I've seen some myths created around it, and I'm going to bust those myths. So let's just begin at the top of the article. In June 8th, 2024, Bloomberg's article titled "Putin is Running Out of Time to Achieve Breakthrough in Ukraine" presented an optimistic prognosis regarding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine in favor of Kiev. And that is this article right here. Putin is running out of time to achieve breakthrough in Ukraine. Russia made limited progress with Ukraine short on weapons. Ukraine halts Russian attacks as billions in arms start flowing. So that is the gist of the narrative. Again, the metric, the go-to metric the Western world uses to determine success on the battlefield in Ukraine, despite it being a war of attrition, are not losses or generated manpower, equipment, and ammunition. It is territory, which is the wrong way to approach it. Now they're claiming that Ukraine has halted Russian attacks, but what is happening in reality is Russia opened yet another front and has forced Ukraine to send what little reserves it has to that front, denying their ability to assist along the rest of the line of contact. It is a strategic dilemma for Ukraine. It is in no way a move and it's in favor of Kiev. The article claims that Russia has made limited progress along the line of contact, including along the newly opened front in Kharkov, and that as billions in arms start flowing into Ukraine, Ukrainian forces will be given the opportunity to counterattack, which is exactly what Russia wants Ukraine to do. They want to take their exhausted reserves and throw them into a counterattack against prepared, well-armed Russian forces. This is what Russia has done over and over again. They have destroyed multiple NATO-armed and trained armies at this point. The billions in arms, Bloomberg cites, refers to the renewed flow of U.S. military assistance after months of delays in passing funding in the U.S. Congress. However, recalling the flagging impact of U.S. arms transfers to Ukraine even before the funding delays, and a closer look at the actual quantities associated with these packages versus Russian military production tells an entirely different story, and that is the story that I will tell. Bloomberg claims that the renewed flow of U.S. arms is eroding Russia's military advantage. However, this is simply not true. So I I begin by talking about artillery shells. People might be sick of hearing this by now, but it is an important aspect of the fighting in Ukraine, and it warrants close attention, close monitoring. Most recent U.S. arms package featured, among other items, badly needed 155mm artillery shells and anti-tank weapons, including the vaunted Javelin missile. Missing from the Pentagon's public press release were the quantities these weapons and munitions were being sent in, and that is a point that I made in my update where I went over each item on the list. There were no quantities of any kind. It is well known that US and European artillery shell production falls short of Russia's by several times. A May 2024 Business Insider article puts the number of Russian shells produced this year at 4.5 million, while the US and Europe combined amount to only 1.3 million. So here is that Business Insider article. All of the links to all of these articles will be in the video description below. Russia is producing shells 3 times faster than Ukraine's NATO allies and for less. And this is also very important. They're making more shells and they're making them for much less. And by the way, this was the most recent security assistance package for Ukraine from the US Department of Defense. And these were all the items that I went over in that previous update. The prospect of Western shell production drastically increasing to match or even exceed Russian production numbers is unrealistic, according to a June 7, 2024 Bloomberg article titled, "America's War Machine Can't Make Basic Artillery Fast Enough." So it's funny that on one hand, Bloomberg is reporting that Putin is running out of time to achieve breakthrough in Ukraine. And on the other hand, Bloomberg is admitting America's war machine can't make basic artillery fast enough. And the premise of the first article is that all of these weapons, all of this ammunition is now flowing into Ukraine. But the premise of the second article is that not enough ammunition can be produced to match or exceed Russian ammunition production. In the Bloomberg piece, various factors are mentioned, ranging from limited material inputs, a lack of trained human resources, and that one in particular, a lack of trained human resources. It could take years to create a large enough pool of human resources to operate in these factories producing these weapons, munitions, and other pieces of military equipment. There's also the need to vastly expand the physical production sites producing both the shells themselves and their various individual components. That means downstream suppliers need to be expanded as well. And there is also the need to consistently procure funding to expand each of these factors, and all of this takes time. And when I say time, I don't mean a few months or a year or two. It could take years and years to achieve this. Russia was working on this for years and years before it launched a special military operation. That is why it has the advantage it does now. And that is why it's taking the US and Europe so long to catch up, because it takes years to do so. The article claims that by 2025, the US should be producing up to 68,155mm artillery shells a month. Even if Europe was able to match these production numbers, it would represent only 2/3 of Ukraine's monthly requirements to achieve its 6,000 round daily rate of fire, which still falls far short of Russia's daily rate of fire, placing Ukraine at a disadvantage. Artillery shell production is relatively straightforward compared to more advanced weapons Ukraine also desperately requires. This includes anti-armor weapons like the Javelin missile. And this is where I get into the Javelin missile. And even though I didn't really get into NLAW in this article, I will go over that as well. The whole point with these artillery shells is that even by 2025, 2027, the US and Europe combined are still not going to be making as many artillery shells as Russia is currently producing right now in the year 2024. So let's talk about the Javelin anti-tank missile. Once hailed as a game changer by the collective Western media, the Javelin is now rarely mentioned either in headlines or even buried deep within articles. The missiles were passed over to Ukraine by the thousands during the initial phases of the Russian special military operation, up to 7,000, or about 1/3 of the US's total inventory, according to the US government and arms industry funded Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in late 2022. So that quantity comes from this article published on CSIS's website, and they go all into all of the details. And even then, they were very skeptical about the claims being made across the rest of the Western media. Will the United States run out of javelins before Russia runs out of tanks? And the answer is essentially yes, they will. Since then, Lockheed Martin, which produces the Javelin missile, claims to have expanded production by up to 15% in a 2024 release, producing up to 2,400 missiles per year, or about 200 per month. So this is where we get into the numbers. The Pentagon won't tell us how many Javelin missiles they're sending to Ukraine. You have to remember, the Javelin missile system has a command launch unit that you hold, has the thermal imaging, the targeting, the control system, essentially. And then you have the missile itself. It's in a canister, attaches to the control unit. You fire the missile, you remove the canister, put a new one on, and you fire the missile again. That is how it works. And so they're producing a certain number of missiles. They're also producing a certain number of these command launch units. And this is actually a system that I worked on as a U.S. Marine, a 2171 electro-optical ordnance repairman. And I remember, and this just to give you an idea, because I'm going to talk about how other countries, including the United States, need access to these 200 missiles per month. They also need access to the CLUs that are produced, because they expire, they need to be replaced, they get damaged, broken, destroyed, even during training. So when I was training to fix the Javelin missile system, I remember another student in the class disassembled the CLU. They put it back together, and they went to hold it up to look at the imaging system. They forgot to put the screws into the body of the casing. All the electronics slid out and smashed into the floor. It was completely written off. So things like that happen in training. This is why you cannot send all 200 missiles to Ukraine every single month. It's very important to keep that in mind. So 2,400 missiles are not being sent entirely to Ukraine. The missiles and less numerous command launch units that fire them are required by the US, other NATO members, and other Lockheed customers around the globe. But let's assume for a moment that all 2,400 missiles are sent to Ukraine each year, and because US stockpiles are at critical levels, let's assume Ukraine is sent Javelins drawn from this monthly production. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say all 2,400 missiles made by Lockheed each year go straight to Ukraine and nowhere else, even though that's completely unrealistic. It's nowhere near all 2,400. Does this mean that each month, because 2,400 works out to a year, works out to 200 a month, does that mean that each month 200 Russian tanks will be damaged or destroyed, adding up to 2,400 lost Russian tanks a year? And the answer is no. According to the US Army's own studies, even trained US soldiers have a 19% hit rate, not kill rate, hit rate, just being able to hit an armored vehicle while utilizing Javelin, TOW, and AT-4 systems, all of which the US has sent to Ukraine throughout the SMO. So this is an Army.mil official Army website. This is a publication from Armor Magazine, winter 2021, and it's titled Infantry Brigade Combat Team Scout Platoon Anti-Armor Engagements at the Joint Readiness Training Center. And this is where they talk about the 19% hit rate, and how even well-trained, relatively well-trained US soldiers who are not rushed through their training like Ukrainians are, how even they, under training conditions much less stressful than actual combat, they're achieving only 19% hit rates with these anti-armor systems, which includes the Javelin missile system. This means that even if Ukraine was receiving 200 missiles a month and firing them at Russian armored vehicles, they would only be scoring about 38 hits. Again, 38 hits, not kills. The number of kills will be actually lower than 38 a month. Comparing these overly optimistic numbers with Russian tank and other armored vehicle production puts all of this in better context. So even if every single Javelin produced by Lockheed was sent to Ukraine, they had 200 missiles a month coming in, they would only be scoring about 38 hits at best on Russian armored vehicles. How many armored vehicles does Russia produce per month? Would you be surprised if it's actually more than Lockheed produces anti-tank missiles, Javelin anti-tank missiles? According to a March 2024 CNN article, that is this one right here, they talk about artillery shells, but also tank production. Discussing Russian military production, it admits Russia is producing up to 125 tanks a month. Other Western sources claim Russia also produces up to 250 other armored vehicles per month, which means armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, for a total of 375 armored vehicles a month. Compare that with the 38 hits Ukraine would be able to inflict, even if the US sent every single Javelin produced straight to Ukraine each month. Russia is producing far more armored vehicles than the US is producing Javelin missiles to destroy them. The story is the same for other anti-armor weapon systems produced across the West. So about 1,000 TOW missiles are produced every single year. This is even less than Javelin missiles. And this is where I want to talk about NLAW, because I didn't include NLAW in this. This is made by Sweden, but I just want to show you two articles. One is from Forbes here. The NLAW missiles the UK rushed to Ukraine may only be useful in desperate circumstances. A lot of people lump NLAW in with Javelin, but it has a very short range relative to the Javelin or, say, the TOW missile, which can hit a target a couple of kilometers downrange. The NLAW at best has an 800-meter range, but far shorter than that. It's a weapon of last resort when you're in close combat with an armored assault, essentially. How many NLAWs is Sweden making every single year? So we have this, and we'll see this number cited very often, 400,000 per year, but this is not true. Saab's huge ramp up in anti-tank weapon ammo production targets 400,000 units a year. And what I have seen is especially Ukrainian media claiming that 400,000 NLAWs are going to be produced each year. And this is great because it's a wonder weapon that will help Ukraine win the war. But if you actually read the article carefully, it says included in that 400,000 number are the companies Carl Gustaf, AT4, and NLAW systems, and others that they didn't list here, all of which are man-portable weapons used against ground vehicles, as well as ammunition. And so everything that this company makes, all of it added up together will equal 400,000 units a year. The NLAW is probably somewhere between TOW missiles and Javelin missiles, somewhere between 1 and 2,000. So the Javelin example, even if you multiplied it by 3, you're still short missiles. You still have fewer missiles capable of destroying Russian armor faster than Russia can produce that armor month to month. That is the whole point of all of this. Considering that the number of Javelin missiles and other ordnance sent to Ukraine will be far less in reality than total monthly production, we begin to see the true measure of US and also European military assistance and how the billions in arms now flowing to Ukraine do not represent a significant change in Ukraine's ability to slow, let alone stop, Russian forces as they continue mounting pressure not only along the existing front but by opening entirely new fronts, creating a wider strategic dilemma for Ukraine, stretching an already insufficient amount of manpower, equipment, and ammunition even further. Empty rhetoric, because that is what all of this is. When we see articles like this, Putin is running out of time to achieve breakthrough in Ukraine. When we see that, that is empty rhetoric. It is propaganda. Despite Bloomberg discounting its article, Putin is running out of time with its other article. America's war machine can't make basic artillery fast enough. it and other Western publications' attempts to convince audiences that the tide is about to shift in Ukraine's favor is a repeat of the same empty rhetoric used to sell Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive as poised to shift the conflict. You remember the lead up to the 2023 Ukrainian offensive or counteroffensive, whatever you want to call it. Do you remember how we were all told that with Western weapons and training, they're going to plow through Russian defenses, they're going to reach the Sea of Azov, they're going to cut the land bridge, they're going to isolate Crimea, and eventually seize back Crimea? Do you remember all of that and how little of that ever translated into reality? Actually, none of it translated into reality. It was a complete disaster. The net gain in territory that year was actually in favor of Russia, not Ukraine. And they lost entire brigades of manpower, equipment, decimated, and they expended huge amounts of ammunition that the collective West is incapable of replacing. And so I talk about that. In reality, the 2023 Ukrainian military operation was soundly defeated by Russian forces, who not only decimated Ukraine's manpower, equipment, and ammunition stocks, but managed to bolster its own numbers and capabilities in the process. Ukrainian attempts to claw back territory it has recently lost in Kharkov will lead to the same fruitless conclusion its 2022 and 2023 offensives did: a questionable chance of actually taking the territory for a guaranteed severe cost in irreplaceable trained manpower and equipment. Because remember, in 2022, Ukraine did manage to take back a significant amount of territory, but at the cost of their entire army, essentially. They had to rebuild their brigades ahead of the 2023 offensive, because you cannot build up brigades in the course of a couple of months or even a year. The offensive was a complete disaster. And now they're doing it again. The whole cycle is repeating itself all over again, including the propaganda used to sell the idea that Ukraine is now poised to turn the tide, finally, after all this time. Today's headlines across the West pretending the tide changing in the fighting across Ukraine represents a now familiar cycle of encouraging Ukraine to fight on in what is otherwise an unwinnable conflict, inflicting an immense and indelible cost on Ukraine in terms of territory, human lives, and economic prospects well into the future. But as has been pointed out many times before, feeding Ukraine into an unwinnable proxy war had been a U.S. objective articulated as early as 2019 in the RAND Corporation's paper extending Russia. I'm going to be citing this very often because everything said in this paper back in 2019 is now coming to pass, obviously and very clearly. This is what the paper said back in 2019. Expanding U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the cost to Russia in both blood and treasure of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded in Afghanistan. So when the U.S. and the rest of its accomplices talk about sending additional weapon systems to Ukraine, escalating the conflict, it is for this purpose. It's not so that Ukraine can win, it's to raise the cost for Russia. The paper also warned, however, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to U.S. prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, which is exactly what is happening right now. Obviously, even in 2019, U.S. policymakers realized Ukraine would not win a U.S.-sponsored proxy war against Russia. The actual objective was to raise the costs of Russian victory high enough to undermine Russia's economy, divide Russian society, and perhaps even eventually precipitate a Soviet Union-style collapse. While Rand's predictions of Ukraine's destruction amid such a proxy war have clearly come to pass, the supposed benefits of this policy have yet to avail themselves and do not appear even plausible at this juncture. Thus, Western rhetoric about Ukraine's soon-to-be good fortune is not based on genuine analysis of the ongoing conflict, but is instead a point of propaganda aimed at encouraging Ukraine to fight on despite all actual analysis warning of the disaster awaiting in doing so. Only time will tell just how far this process plays out, to where the U.S. and its partners are no longer pushing Ukraine onto the battlefield and are instead taken to the negotiation table. In the meantime, the billions in arms flowing into Ukraine will continue to have the same impact they've had all along, ensuring disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows, ultimately leading Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, just as the Rand Corporation warned back in 2019. So that is the article in its entirety, going over, say, the Javelin missile system, the TOW missile system, the NLAW, and artillery shells. There are a lot of items on that U.S. Department of Defense assistance package release, press release. There are a lot of items there. We're spot checking them and using it as an example rather than exhaustively going through all of these systems. But I could assure you that other systems listed on that assistance package or in previous assistance packages, especially anything to do with air defenses, you're going to see the same situation, if not even worse. As a matter of fact, the US is talking about sending additional Patriot missile systems to Ukraine, and I'm sure I'm going to get into all of that as well in great detail, again, explaining how sending these systems piecemeal to Ukraine prevents Ukraine from ever building up any sort of critical mass in any realm of military capability, let alone total military capabilities. And it just simply isn't feasible for Ukraine to turn the tide in fighting when they are so badly outnumbered and outgunned, and where the assistance from the West is coming in so slowly that it's destroyed faster than it could be replaced. And that is going to go all the way back to the problem, the fundamental problem, the systemic problem the West has in terms of military industrial production versus Russia. And if this is the problem the collective West is having fighting Russia, it will be many times worse as they continue provoking a very similar conflict with China in the Asia-Pacific region and an entire ocean away from anywhere the US and its European allies are located on a map. So we have to keep a close eye on all of this. Getting into the details of all of this can get tedious at times, but it's important to understand what is really going on versus what these headlines and what these articles are trying to convince us of is happening. So if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest people follow me on Telegram. I'm on there almost daily. That is the social media platform of choice that I put all of my content on, including entire backups of all of my videos and links to my articles, which are censored. This NEO article cannot be posted on X. It is censored on X. So you have to go to Telegram to actually follow the link and read it in its entirety. Also in the video description are all of the links that I referenced in this video, including the New Eastern Outlook article that I wrote. And there are also ways in the video description below for you to help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or even if you have no additional resources and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.